October 12, 1783. The autumn wind carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves across the rolling hills of Frederick County, Maryland, where Thornfield Manor stood like a monument to prosperity built on secrets too dark for decent society to acknowledge. The estate sprawled across nearly 4,000 acres of prime tobacco land, its brick mansion commanding views of the Potomac River Valley that stretched toward the distant Blue Ridge Mountains. Within those walls, beneath the veneer of colonial respectability and Christian virtue, a horror was taking shape that would challenge every assumption about family, duty, and the bonds that tie civilized people to their moral foundations. Tell us from where are you watching this video by writing in the comments so that we can know how far our videos are reaching, and do subscribe so that you keep getting regular thrilling stories that are to come next. The master of Thornfield Manor was Cornelius Whitmore, a man whose 45 years had been spent accumulating wealth, influence, and the kind of power that allowed him to shape reality according to his desires, rather than accepting the limitations that constrained lesser men. Standing well over 6 feet tall with iron-gray hair and eyes the color of winter storms, he possessed the bearing of someone who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. Cornelius had built his fortune through a combination of shrewd business dealings, strategic marriages, and an absolute refusal to allow moral considerations to interfere with profitable opportunities. His first wife, Margaret Thornfield, had brought him the estate through her family's colonial land grants. His second wife, Rebecca Ashford, had provided connections to Richmond's tobacco merchants and London trading houses. Both women had died under circumstances that raised no official questions, but generated enough whispered speculation to ensure that Cornelius remained unmarried for the past 8 years. The household at Thornfield Manor reflected his character. Everything arranged with mathematical precision, every servant trained to anticipate his wishes before he expressed them, every detail of daily life orchestrated to maintain the fiction that he was a gentleman of unimpeachable reputation, rather than a predator who had learned to hunt within the boundaries of legal respectability. It was into this carefully controlled environment that fate, or perhaps something more calculated than fate, brought 8-year-old Margaret Sinclair on a rain-soaked November evening that would forever alter the trajectory of both their lives. The child arrived at Thornfield's gates in circumstances that seemed designed to appeal to Cornelius's particular combination of opportunism and calculated charity. Her parents, David and Mary Sinclair, had been traveling south from Pennsylvania to establish a new life in the Carolina territories when their wagon had overturned while crossing a swollen creek 20 miles from the manor. Both adults had drowned in the rushing water, leaving behind only a traumatized little girl who had survived by clinging to the wagon's canvas cover until local farmers found her the following morning. The farmers, simple people who lacked the resources to care for an orphaned child, had brought Margaret to Thornfield Manor because Cornelius was known throughout Frederick County as a man of wealth and Christian generosity who had previously provided assistance to families facing hardship. They expected him to arrange for her placement with relatives, or perhaps provide temporary shelter, while more permanent arrangements were made through church or civil authorities. But when Cornelius first saw Margaret standing in his front hall, a small figure with dark hair and large eyes that reflected both intelligence and vulnerability, he recognized an opportunity that transcended ordinary charity. The child bore a striking resemblance to his first wife, particularly around the eyes and the delicate line of her jaw. More importantly, her circumstances made her completely dependent on his protection, while her obvious good breeding suggested she possessed the intelligence and refinement necessary for the role he was already beginning to envision for her. What relatives might the child have? Cornelius asked the farmers, his voice carrying the measured tone of a man gathering information rather than simply expressing concern. "None that we know of, sir," replied the elder farmer, a weathered man named Jacob Miller, who had spent his life working land that barely provided subsistence for his own family. The parents spoke of starting fresh in Carolina, but never mentioned family connections. The child keeps asking for someone named Uncle William, but she's too young to provide useful details about where he might be found. Cornelius nodded gravely, already formulating the response that would serve his purposes while maintaining his reputation for Christian virtue. Then she shall remain here at Thornfield Manor until such relatives can be located. It is our Christian duty to provide shelter for orphaned children, and I have both the resources and the moral obligation to ensure her proper care and education." The farmers departed with expressions of gratitude for Cornelius's generosity, unaware that they had just delivered a lamb into the den of a wolf who had spent years perfecting his predatory techniques. Margaret, exhausted by trauma and confusion, was placed in the care of Mrs. Hannah Foster, the stern but competent housekeeper who had managed Thornfield Manor's domestic operations for over 20 years. Mrs. Foster was a woman who prided herself on discretion and efficiency, qualities that had made her invaluable to a master whose activities occasionally required both. She asked no uncomfortable questions about Cornelius's decision to take permanent responsibility for Margaret, and when the child's initial inquiries about Uncle William received no satisfactory answers, Mrs. Foster simply explained that Mr. Whitmore was conducting a thorough search that required time and patience. The transformation of Margaret Sinclair from orphaned refugee to pampered ward was gradual but comprehensive. Within weeks of her arrival, she had been provided with clothing appropriate to her new station, assigned tutors for her education, and given quarters in a wing of the manor house that had previously been reserved for family members. To outside observers, Cornelius appeared to be providing exactly the kind of generous care that his reputation suggested, raising an orphaned child with the same attention he might have devoted to a daughter of his own blood. But from the beginning, there were aspects of Margaret's treatment that suggested a purpose beyond simple charity. Her education, while comprehensive, was carefully designed to prepare her for a specific role rather than provide her with the broad knowledge that might allow her to make independent choices about her future. She learned music, French, household management, and the social graces required of a plantation mistress, but she was given no exposure to mathematics, law, or business affairs that might enable her to understand or challenge the legal arrangements that governed her life. But when Cornelius first saw Margaret standing in his front hall, a small figure with dark hair and large eyes that reflected both intelligence and vulnerability, he recognized an opportunity that transcended ordinary charity. The child bore a striking resemblance to his first wife, particularly around the eyes and the delicate line of her jaw. More importantly, her circumstances made her completely dependent on his protection, while her obvious good breeding suggested she possessed the intelligence and refinement necessary for the role he was already beginning to envision for her. "What relatives might the child have?" Cornelius asked the farmers, his voice carrying the measured tone of a man gathering information rather than simply expressing concern. "None that we know of, sir," replied the elder farmer, a weathered man named Jacob Muller, who had spent his life working land that barely provided subsistence for his own family. The parents spoke of starting fresh in Carolina, but never mentioned family connections. "The child keeps asking for someone named Uncle William, but she's too young to provide useful details about where he might be found." Cornelius nodded gravely, already formulating the response that would serve his purposes while maintaining his reputation for Christian virtue. "Then she shall remain here at Thornfield Manor until such relatives can be located. It is our Christian duty to provide shelter for orphaned children, and I have both the resources and the moral obligation to ensure her proper care and education." The farmers departed with expressions of gratitude for Cornelius's generosity, unaware that they had just delivered a lamb into the den of a wolf who had spent years perfecting his predatory techniques. Margaret, exhausted by trauma and confusion, was placed in the care of Mrs. Hannah Foster, the stern but competent housekeeper who had managed Thornfield Manor's domestic operations for over 20 years. Mrs. Foster was a woman who prided herself on discretion and efficiency, qualities that had made her invaluable to a master whose activities occasionally required both. She asked no uncomfortable questions about Cornelius's decision to take permanent responsibility for Margaret, and when the child's initial inquiries about Uncle William received no satisfactory answers, Mrs. Foster simply explained that Mr. Whitmore was conducting a thorough search that required time and patience. The transformation of Margaret Sinclair from orphaned refugee to pampered ward was gradual but comprehensive. Within weeks of her arrival, she had been provided with clothing appropriate to her new station, assigned tutors for her education, and given quarters in a wing of the manor house that had previously been reserved for family members. To outside observers, Cornelius appeared to be providing exactly the kind of generous care that his reputation suggested, raising an orphaned child with the same attention he might have devoted to a daughter of his own blood. But from the beginning, there were aspects of Margaret's treatment that suggested a purpose beyond simple charity. Her education, while comprehensive, was carefully designed to prepare her for a specific role, rather than provide her with the broad knowledge that might allow her to make independent choices about her future. She learned music, French, household management, and the social graces required of a plantation mistress, but she was given no exposure to mathematics, law, or business affairs that might enable her to understand or challenge the legal arrangements that governed her life. More significantly, Cornelius began almost immediately to shape Margaret's understanding of family relationships and social obligations in ways that would serve his ultimate purposes. He spoke frequently about the special bonds that existed between protectors and their charges, emphasizing her dependence on his generosity and her obligation to demonstrate gratitude through absolute obedience to his wishes. "You must understand, my dear Margaret," he would say during their evening conversations in his study, "that you are not merely a guest in this house. You have become part of the Whitmore family, with all the privileges and responsibilities that such membership entails. The relationship between a guardian and his ward is sacred, more binding than ordinary social connections because it is based on choice rather than mere accident of birth." These conversations, conducted in the intimate setting of a room lined with law books and family portraits, gradually established a framework for understanding that would serve Cornelius's purposes as Margaret matured. He presented himself not merely as her benefactor, but as the architect of her entire future, the man whose wisdom and protection were all that stood between her and a world that would show no mercy to an orphaned girl without family connections or independent resources. As Margaret grew from child to adolescent, Cornelius's attention to her development became increasingly specific and controlling. He personally selected her tutors, monitored her correspondence, and carefully managed her exposure to other families in Frederick County society. She was allowed to attend church services and occasional social gatherings, but always under his direct supervision and with clear instructions about appropriate behavior and conversation topics. The isolation was subtle, but effective. Margaret developed few friendships with girls her own age and no relationships with potential suitors, not because such contacts were explicitly forbidden, but because Cornelius had arranged her life in ways that made them impractical or impossible. She learned to see him as the center of her universe, the source of all security and approval, the person whose opinion mattered more than any other consideration. By 1791, when Margaret had reached her 16th birthday, Cornelius judged that the psychological foundation for his ultimate plan was sufficiently established to begin the next phase of her preparation. The process began with subtle changes in how she was addressed by household staff and presented to visitors. Rather than being introduced as Cornelius's ward, she was increasingly referred to as his adopted daughter, with legal papers to support this new status quietly filed with Frederick County authorities. The adoption papers, drawn up by Cornelius's lawyer with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized all his legal arrangements, established Margaret not merely as his daughter, but as his heir, entitled to inherit Thornfield Manor and its associated properties in the absence of other direct descendants. To anyone examining the documents, the arrangement appeared to represent nothing more than the generous provision of a childless widower for an orphaned girl he had raised as his own daughter. But the papers contained subtle provisions that would serve Cornelius's deeper purposes when the time came to implement them. Margaret's inheritance was structured in ways that required her continued residence at Thornfield Manor, and her compliance with the family traditions and moral obligations that Cornelius deemed appropriate for a woman of her station. Any attempt to leave the estate permanently or to marry without his explicit consent would result in the forfeiture of her inheritance and her reversion to the legal status of a penniless orphan with no claim on family resources. As Margaret's 18th birthday approached in 1793, Cornelius began to introduce the final elements of his long-term plan. The conversations in his study took on a different tone, focusing less on her general education and more on her specific duties as the future mistress of Thornfield Manor. He spoke about the importance of preserving family bloodlines, the sacred obligations that bound each generation to those that would follow, and the sometimes unconventional arrangements that necessity might require of people who took their family responsibilities seriously. "You must understand, Margaret," he said during one such conversation, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never been contradicted on matters he considered important, "that your position as my heir carries obligations that extend far beyond simple property ownership. You are the vessel through which the Whitmore bloodline will continue, and that responsibility may require sacrifices that ordinary women never face." Margaret, now a young woman of remarkable beauty and intelligence despite the isolation that had characterized her upbringing, listened to these conversations with growing unease. Something in Cornelius's tone and the increasing frequency of his references to bloodlines and family continuity suggested purposes that she couldn't quite identify, but that filled her with a dread she couldn't rationally explain. The truth began to emerge in the spring of 1794, when Cornelius announced that he had received a proposal of marriage for Margaret from a distant cousin who lived in the western counties of Virginia. The suitor, he explained, was a man of good character and substantial property who understood the importance of preserving family connections and consolidating wealth within established bloodlines. Margaret's first sight of her intended husband came in the form of a miniature portrait that Cornelius presented to her during their evening conversation in his study. The painting depicted a man who appeared to be perhaps 35 years old, with strong features and dark hair that showed distinguished traces of silver at the temples. But what struck Margaret most forcefully was the man's extraordinary resemblance to Cornelius himself, so striking that they might have been brothers rather than merely distant cousins. "His name is Cornelius Whitmore," her guardian explained, watching her face carefully as she studied the portrait. "He inherited property in the Shenandoah Valley and has built quite a successful tobacco operation there. But he lacks the social connections and cultural refinement that come with generations of established position in Maryland society. The marriage would benefit both parties. He would gain access to our family's reputation and business connections, while you would help ensure that our bloodline continues through legitimate heirs who understand their obligations to family tradition." Margaret studied the portrait with growing confusion and alarm. The resemblance to Cornelius was so pronounced that she wondered if the artist had somehow used her guardian as a model, creating an image that represented an idealized younger version of the man who had raised her rather than depicting an actual person. "But his name is the same as yours," she said, her voice betraying the anxiety that his announcement had created. "How is this possible if he is only a distant cousin?" Cornelius's explanation was both smooth and chilling in its calculated plausibility. The cousin had been named for the same ancestor, a common practice in families seeking to honor their forebears and maintain connections across generations. This Cornelius Whitmore had built his Virginia plantation through hard work and determination, but he needed a wife who could bring social position and refined breeding to complement his material success. The marriage preparations began immediately, but they followed a pattern that should have warned Margaret about the true nature of what was being planned. Rather than the elaborate public ceremony typical of wealthy Maryland families, this would be a private affair conducted at Thornfield Manor, with only carefully selected witnesses. Cornelius explained this unusual arrangement as necessary because of the groom's family obligations in Virginia and the bride's lack of extensive family connections that would normally be involved in wedding planning. As summer gave way to autumn, Margaret found herself increasingly troubled by aspects of the arrangement that seemed fundamentally wrong. Wedding invitations were allegedly sent to various Whitmore relatives, but no responses ever arrived at Thornfield Manor. When she asked to see letters of acceptance or correspondence from her intended husband, Cornelius explained that such communications were being handled through his lawyer to avoid burdening her with unnecessary details. Most disturbing of all, Margaret was asked to sign various legal documents related to her inheritance rights and the marriage settlement. But when she attempted to read them carefully, both Cornelius and his lawyer assured her that the legal language was too complex for anyone without professional training to understand properly. The breakthrough that would save Margaret from a fate worse than death came through her own intelligence and determination rather than any outside intervention. Unable to sleep due to anxiety about her upcoming marriage, she began conducting her own investigation of the arrangements that had been made on her behalf. The key discovery came when Margaret found a cache of documents in Cornelius's study that revealed the full scope of his deception. There was no cousin in Virginia. There had never been a cousin. The marriage contract was between Cornelius Whitmore of Thornfield Manor and Margaret Sinclair Whitmore, identified as both his adopted daughter and his intended bride. The documents revealed a scheme of breathtaking audacity and legal sophistication. By adopting Margaret first, Cornelius had established both her inheritance rights and his paternal authority over her. By marrying her afterward, he would maintain control over the estate while ensuring that any children born to their union would be indisputably legitimate heirs to the Whitmore fortune. Even more horrifying were Cornelius's detailed notes about his long-term plans for their marriage. He had calculated that Margaret's youth and his established position in Maryland society would allow them to present themselves as a conventional married couple when conducting business or traveling. The adoption papers would remain filed, but unmentioned, and their children would grow up knowing Cornelius only as their father, never learning the truth about their mother's origins or the circumstances of their parents' marriage. Margaret's confrontation with Cornelius came on the night before their scheduled wedding ceremony, when she could no longer contain the horror and revulsion that his plan had created. She found him in his study, reviewing final preparations for the ceremony that would complete his monstrous scheme. "There is no cousin," she said, standing in the doorway with the documents she had discovered clutched in her trembling hands. "There never was. You intend to marry me yourself." Cornelius looked up from his papers with the expression of a man whose carefully laid plans had encountered an unexpected obstacle, but who remained confident in his ability to overcome it. The mask of paternal affection that he had worn for 11 years finally slipped completely, revealing the calculating predator who had been planning this moment since the night she had first arrived at Thornfield Manor. "You are more perceptive than I anticipated," he said, rising from his chair with the deliberate movements of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. "Yes, Margaret. Tomorrow you will become my wife. You will also remain my daughter, my heir, and the mother of the children who will carry on the Whitmore name. It is an arrangement that serves everyone's interests perfectly." "Everyone's interests but mine," Margaret replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, despite the terror that coursed through her veins. Cornelius's smile was cold as a winter grave. "Your interests are identical to mine, my dear. They have been since the night I found you orphaned and alone after your parents' unfortunate accident. Do you think your survival was mere chance? Do you think I chose to raise you out of simple Christian charity?" The implication in his words struck Margaret like a physical blow. "The wagon accident, you arranged it." "I arranged nothing," Cornelius said, though his tone suggested meanings that his words did not explicitly convey. "But when I learned that a family carrying considerable wealth was planning to travel through Frederick County on their way to Carolina, and when their wagon happened to overturn at a creek crossing during a particularly severe storm, I recognized an opportunity that Providence had provided." Margaret realized with crystalline clarity that she was completely alone with a man who had spent 11 years grooming her for this ultimate violation. But unlike many victims of such calculated predation, she had been given an education that included not just social graces, but also enough practical knowledge to recognize the legal and financial mechanisms that Cornelius had used to trap her. Her salvation came not through physical resistance, which would have been futile against a man of Cornelius's size and strength, but through the psychological understanding that his years of careful instruction had inadvertently provided. She had learned to read people's motivations, to recognize the difference between genuine emotion and calculated manipulation, and to identify the weaknesses that lay beneath facades of power and control. Cornelius's greatest weakness was his pride in his own cleverness, and his need for validation from someone who could appreciate the sophistication of his scheme. Like many intelligent predators, he could not resist the opportunity to explain his brilliance to a victim who possessed the education necessary to understand what he had accomplished. "I need to understand something before I resign myself to this fate," Margaret said, allowing defeat to creep into her voice while her mind worked frantically to identify escape possibilities. "How did you know my parents would be traveling through Frederick County with enough wealth to make their deaths profitable? How did you arrange to be the one who would benefit from my orphaned status?" Cornelius settled back into his chair, his satisfaction evident as he recognized what he interpreted as her capitulation. For the next hour, he provided a detailed explanation of how he had learned about the Sinclair family's travel plans, how he had positioned himself to benefit from their misfortune, and how he had spent 11 years carefully preparing Margaret for the role she would play in preserving and extending his power. But Margaret was using the time he spent boasting to memorize every detail of his confession, while formulating a plan that would expose his crimes to authorities who possessed both the legal standing and the moral courage to act against him. Unlike the isolated frontier community where Jonathan Caldwell had operated, Frederick County was part of a legal system that included educated judges, experienced prosecutors, and established procedures for dealing with complex crimes involving property fraud and child exploitation. The wedding ceremony scheduled for the following morning would provide the perfect opportunity to expose Cornelius's crimes in front of witnesses whose testimony would be accepted by any court in Maryland. Margaret spent the remainder of that night preparing evidence and rehearsing the words that would destroy the man who had spent 11 years planning her destruction. On November 15, 1794, the great hall of Thornfield Manor filled with carefully selected witnesses who expected to observe nothing more unusual than the marriage of a devoted guardian to his adopted daughter. The guest list included Frederick County magistrates, prominent planters and their wives, local ministers, and several members of Maryland's colonial elite who had known Cornelius for decades. Margaret appeared in her wedding gown, a dress of ivory silk that had belonged to Cornelius's first wife, altered to fit her smaller frame, looking pale but composed. To the assembled guests, she seemed to be an appropriately nervous bride, perhaps overwhelmed by the significance of the day but resigned to her duty. When Reverend Thomas Whitfield reached the traditional question about impediments to marriage, Margaret spoke in a voice that carried clearly throughout the hall. "I must confess a deception before God and these witnesses. I am not Margaret Whitmore, adopted daughter of Cornelius Whitmore. I am Margaret Sinclair, and this man has spent 11 years grooming me for the violation you are witnessing today, using forged documents and legal manipulation to create circumstances that serve his unnatural desires." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Cornelius attempted to silence her by claiming she was suffering from hysteria, but Margaret had prepared for this moment with the thoroughness of a prosecutor building a case. She produced the documents she had discovered in his study, presenting them to the assembled witnesses with calm precision that made her accusations impossible to dismiss. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The forged adoption papers with their subtle provisions for maintaining control over Margaret's future. The marriage contract that explicitly identified the groom and the adoptive father as the same person. The detailed notes outlining Cornelius's long-term plans for their marriage and the children he expected her to bear. But Margaret had saved her most devastating revelation for last. "There is one more crime you must know about," she announced, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "Mr. Whitmore's previous wives did not die of natural causes as he has claimed. I found correspondence hidden in his study that describes the symptoms of arsenic poisoning, along with receipts for the purchase of rat poison in quantities far exceeding any legitimate household need. The accusation of serial uxoricide combined with the evidence of Margaret's systematic grooming created a scandal that even Cornelius's wealth and social connections could not suppress. Several witnesses were magistrates themselves, men whose legal training enabled them to recognize both the validity of Margaret's evidence and the sophisticated nature of the crimes she had exposed. Cornelius was immediately placed under arrest pending formal investigation, despite his protests and attempts to characterize the entire affair as the product of a mentally unstable young woman's imagination. The subsequent trial became one of the most sensational in Maryland's colonial history, establishing legal precedents for crimes involving child exploitation and systematic psychological manipulation. Margaret used her inheritance, legally hers as Cornelius's adopted daughter and the sole surviving victim of his crimes, to establish schools throughout Maryland and Virginia that provided education and protection for orphaned children. Her work influenced the development of legal safeguards that protected countless vulnerable children in the decades that followed. The story of Margaret Sinclair serves as a reminder that evil often wears the mask of respectability and that the greatest predators are those who use legal and social institutions to facilitate their crimes. Her courage in exposing the truth despite overwhelming personal risk not only saved her own life, but established protections that would benefit generations of children who might otherwise have fallen victim to similar exploitation. Thornfield Manor was sold to satisfy legal judgments against Cornelius's estate, but the building stood empty for years before finally being demolished. Local residents reported that the land seemed cursed, refusing to produce healthy crops and driving away livestock that were brought to graze there. The property eventually became part of a state forest, where visitors today can still find traces of the foundation stones, though few know the dark history they represent.